Chapter 1. The Binding. Chris Jenkins stared out the second-floor window of his new home, counting the boarded-up buildings that lined Marlowe Street. 5 on the right, 7 across the way. The July heat pressed against the glass like a living thing, making the warped window frame creak. In the distance, a police siren wailed, then faded. What he was able to hear was not bad, exactly. As far as Chris could tell, bad was probably on par with things like eviction, default, and last payday. It wasn't like he was totally tired. He was, but he had enough strength to crack the door open and listen to the one-sided conversation his mother was having. Most likely it was with his grandmother. It didn't sound like it was going in his favor, nor his mother's. What he did hear was just as a dose of new reality for them. There was a pause. Too long for anything complicated, but he thought it best to twist the door handle and close the door, releasing it and slide back into bed. As he completed his stealth mission to eavesdrop, the pacing and conversation continued. Chris looked outside the old wooden pane window. He watched a few robins fly and bank suddenly around the tree that partially covered his window. The new leaves made the tree that had been barren a little less naked, and a bitter reminder that spring was marching onwards, giving way to what would be a beautiful summer. The boy scanned the room, looking for something to occupy his mind when he came across the twice-read comic book dangling from the edge of his bed. A gift from his mother, he recalled, who had no idea what kids read nowadays. Most of the kids, he reminded her, had tablets and book readers. His mother reminded him that those kids must have had great families. She left that statement to dangle in the air, and he caught the "be grateful for what you got" message, loud and clear. Soon, a school library would have his name and photo, allowing him to not be bored during the school year. City taxes at work. "You'll be okay by yourself?" His mother appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her blue hospital scrubs. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I'm only on second shift until 9. "Mama," Chris said, turning from the window. At 13, he'd learned to sound more confident than he felt. "I can make the mac and cheese, or a sandwich, and I'll lock the doors. I'm good." Tanya Jenkins studied her son for a moment, unconvinced. They'd only been in this neighborhood for 2 weeks, just long enough to unpack their essential belongings and for her to start her new job at Mercy General. 30 minutes by car, on a good day. 2 hours by bus should the car decide it was on strike. The move had been a gamble, a chance at homeownership in exchange for a neighborhood that had seen better days. "Grandma called," she said finally, pocketing her ID badge. "Said we could still come stay with her if we wanted." Chris shook his head. He'd overheard enough late-night phone arguments to know what that offer really meant. His grandmother had called the purchase of this house throwing good money after bad. She'd never approved of anything his mother had done since Chris was born, including Chris. "We're good here," Chris insisted. "I like the house. Very urban." He smiled, his teeth flashing a blend of leftover Captain Crunch cereal and plaque. It wasn't entirely a lie. The house itself was decent. A narrow 3-bedroom row home with original hardwood floors and a tiny backyard. It just happened to sit on a block where half the properties stood empty, their windows dark and accusing. Tanya crossed the room and pressed her palm against his cheek. "I left $10 on the counter. If you want, you can walk down to the corner store and get yourself some snacks. Just be back before I leave at 3. Chris's eyes widened. "For real? By myself?" "Don't be a smartass. Just stay on the main road and come straight back." She glanced at her watch. She smiled for a change. "Maybe you'll meet some kids from the neighborhood before school starts next month." They both knew that was unlikely. In the 2 weeks they'd been here, Chris hadn't seen a single person his age. Just old folks sitting on porches and the occasional group of adult men hanging out on corners. He imagined that they were all waiting for their chance to tell him about the good old days of the neighborhood. Maybe why the Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali fight was revolutionary, or SpaghettiOs were designed to keep kids ignorant and depressed. After his mother left to run errands before her shift, Chris pocketed the $10 and headed outside. The heat hit him like a wall, the sidewalk radiating warmth through the thin soles of his sneakers. He walked with purpose, eyes forward, trying to look like he belonged. The neighborhood was a patchwork of neglect and stubborn pride. Some houses featured meticulous flower boxes and freshly swept steps, while others crumbled quietly behind chain-link fences. A group of old men played dominoes under a tree in the small community garden, their laughter carrying on the sticky air. "Hey, young blood," called one of the old men as Chris passed. "You the one moved into Ms. Perry's old place?" Chris didn't slow his stride. He flipped off the old man and kept moving. "You see that?" he heard one man whisper. "Kinda crap is that?" Chris didn't hear the rest of the grumbling, but moved to the other side of the street and kept moving. He continued down Marlowe Street to where it intersected with Malcolm X Boulevard, a wider street with actual businesses. A check cashing place, a takeout restaurant with bulletproof glass, and on the corner, the mean green liquor and convenience. Chris hesitated outside the store. His mother hadn't specifically said he couldn't go in, but he knew liquor stores were generally off limits. Through the window, however, he could see rows of snacks and a cooler with sodas, and it was closer than walking to the supermarket 4 blocks further. A bell jingled as he pushed the door open. The store was narrow but deep, with high shelves creating aisles that stretched toward the back. Behind the counter, a middle-aged Asian man was stocking cigarettes. He was mostly bald, but his body was in a fairly lean condition. In the corner near the window sat an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her wispy white hair pulled back in a bun, eyes closed as if napping. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone neutral. "Just looking for some snacks," Chris replied, heading toward the chip aisle. The man nodded and returned to his task. Chris browsed the selection, calculating how to maximize his $10. He was comparing 2 different brands of chips, doing mental math at the outrageous prices, when the bell above the door jingled again. 3 men entered. Something in their quick, tense movements made Chris instinctively step back, partially hidden behind the shelf. "Empty the register," the tallest one demanded, pulling a gun from his waistband and pointing it at the store owner. "Now." The second man vaulted over the counter while the third stood watch by the door. None of them had noticed Chris or the elderly woman yet. The store owner raised his hands. "Please take what you want." Chris's heart hammered in his chest. He should run. He should hide. But his feet felt rooted to the floor, his muscles locked with fear. A bag of chips slipped from his numb fingers, crinkling loudly as it hit the ground. The sound drew the attention of the gunman, who spun toward the noise. "Who's there? Come out now." Chris stepped into view, hands raised like he'd seen in movies. "Don't shoot," he whispered. "Damn it," the man by the door hissed. "There's a kid." "Shut up," snapped the gunman. "Get over here, kid. Now." Chris moved forward on wooden legs. This couldn't be happening. Not his first day out alone in the new neighborhood. "Hurry up," the man behind the counter shouted, stuffing cash into a bag. "I said move." The gunman gestured with his weapon. Chris tried to obey, but his foot caught on the edge of a display. As he stumbled, the gunman flinched and a deafening crack split the air. Pain exploded in Chris's chest. Sharp, then oddly warm. He looked down to see a dark stain spreading across his t-shirt. The world tilted sideways as he collapsed. Through darkening vision, Chris saw something impossible. The elderly woman in the corner was standing. No, running, her wheelchair empty behind her. Her body seemed to shimmer and change, becoming younger, more vibrant. She moved with impossible speed toward Chris, her hands outstretched. "Not your time," she whispered, her voice clear in his mind, though her lips didn't move. The last thing Chris saw before consciousness faded was the woman's form dissolving into particles of golden light that flowed toward him like water. Beeping machines, antiseptic smell, scratchy sheets. Chris opened his eyes to fluorescent lights and his mother's tear-streaked face. "Oh, thank God," Tanya breathed, clutching his hand. "Chris, baby, can you hear me?" He nodded, his throat dry. "What happened?" A doctor appeared at his bedside, flipping through a chart. Young man, you are either the luckiest kid in Baltimore or we need to rewrite some medical textbooks. What do you mean? Chris croaked. The bullet grazed you, the doctor explained. Based on the blood on your shirt and the initial paramedic report, we expected much worse. But when we examined you, there was barely a mark. Just some bruising. No entry wound. Chris's hand went to his chest. The memory of pain, of warmth spreading across his shirt felt so real. But I felt it. I felt the bullet. Shock can cause phantom sensations, the doctor said. The important thing is you're physically fine. We'd like to keep you overnight for observation, but there's no medical reason you can't go home. After the doctor left, his mother leaned in close. What happened in there? They said there was a robbery. Chris tried to remember. I was looking at chips and these guys came in. One had a gun. The memory was fragmented, dreamlike. I think I tripped. And then there was this old lady. What old lady? Tanya asked. Chris frowned. The image was slipping away like water through fingers. In a wheelchair, but then she was standing and there was this golden light. Tanya pressed a hand to his forehead. You don't have a fever. Mama, Chris protested, though even he wasn't sure what he'd seen. I guess I don't know. 3 hours later, against medical advice but with no insurance to cover an overnight stay, Tanya ushered Chris home and allowed him rest. She did manage to find chips and salsa for him. The house felt different somehow when they entered. The air heavier, the shadows deeper. Or maybe it was just Chris, changed by his brush with death. I called work, Tanya said, helping Chris to the couch. My supervisor said I can make up the shift tomorrow, but I need to leave in an hour if we want to keep a roof over our heads. You can go, Mama. I'm okay. She looked at him skeptically. You were just shot at. But I'm fine. The doctor said so. Chris forced a smile. I'll just watch TV and rest. After heated negotiation, Tanya agreed to go to work, but only after settling Chris in bed with a book. The Bible, as his grandmother had insisted, snacks, and strict instructions not to leave the house until she returned. The moment the front door closed, exhaustion claimed him. Chris drifted into a deep sleep, only to awaken hours later to the sensation of being watched. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating a figure perched at the foot of his bed. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with sleek black hair cut in a sharp bob. She wore a high-collared sleeveless shirt in deep crimson and white black slacks and silk slippers. Her posture was perfect, her dark eyes intent. Who are you? Chris gasped, scrambling back against the headboard. How did you get in here? The woman tilted her head, studying him like an interesting specimen. Tell me, young man, what do you see? A pretty lady. Chris's voice was shy but firm. The woman turned her head, slightly blushed, but she looked back and relaxed her face. Thank you, she whispered. Something in her voice, the cadence, the slight accent, tugged at Chris's memory. He squinted, taking in the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw. You're the old lady from the store. She smiled, revealing perfect teeth. Giancaio. I used to be called Chi-Chi. Easier for you, I guess. She gestured to herself. This is how I looked when I was 23, at the height of my power. Chris tugged at his hair and face for a second before looking around the room. There was no one but him and a glowing Chinese woman. But you were... Chris started to put his thoughts together. Dead? Not quite. Dying? Certainly. She shifted closer, the mattress not even dipping under her weight. My body was 90 years old, worn out. When that foolish man shot you, I made a choice. Chris's hand went to his chest where the bullet should have entered. What choice? I adopted you. I bound my spirit to yours. Chi-Chi said simply. Healed your wound with the last of my corporeal energy. My body is gone now. An empty shell. But I am here. Her expression grew serious, for which you should be exceedingly grateful. Chris stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You're a ghost? So dismissive. She tisked. I am a spirit practitioner. What your horror movies might call a medium or exorcist, except with actual power and training. Or rather, I was. Now I am attached to you. Why me? Chris whispered. Chi-Chi's eyes softened. Because you were dying. Because you are young. Because the universe put you in my path when I was already contemplating my transition. She stood, pacing the small bedroom. I've spent my life fighting, containing, and sometimes helping spirits. I wasn't ready to become one just yet. Chi-Chi paused for a moment. If I didn't, you would have died. I would probably have died. Had I died in my own body, I would have died as an old 90-year-old woman. Chi-Chi shook her head. That was not the kind of afterlife I wanted. Chris watched her move. For something supposedly incorporeal, she seemed remarkably solid. Can other people see you? Only if I wish it. And even then, only those with natural sensitivity. She turned to face him fully. I needed to explore, to understand the parameters of our new arrangement. But now we must talk about what happens next. What do you mean? I mean, young Chris Jenkins, that you have inherited more than just my spiritual presence. My powers, my abilities, my obligations, they are now yours as well. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. You are now a GhostFighter, whether you want to be or not. A what? Chris shook his head. Look, I don't know what's happening, but this has to be a dream or something. People don't just become whatever you're talking about. No, they don't. Chi-Chi agreed. Usually it takes years of training, meditation, and study. You're getting the accelerated course out of necessity. She sighed, a strangely human gesture for a spirit. Rest tonight. Tomorrow your education begins. But rest, Chi-Chi repeated, her form already beginning to fade. She waved her hand, watching Chris's eyes flutter, and soon he was slumped awkwardly and lightly snoring. The television started to click off and on. Shows became static and snow. The radio played and switched to the AM station. Voices started to make their way into the room. Faint at first, but started to swirl into a large chorus. Initially, Chris sat alone in the moonlit bedroom, but soon a soft light lingered and caressed his face.